Well, thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and thank you to the organizers of the event today. Um, two very quick things. First, I'm originally from Seattle, and I'm a Mariners fan. Anybody who watches baseball, they've been out of the playoffs for 21 years, and they're playing right now, and I'm here instead. So, no. So this is my dedication to elections. The other thing that I want to say is it's interesting hearing everybody, doom and gloom here today, which is, I think, reasonable. But many of us here on this panel have worked on elections in Afghanistan and Iraq and Azerbaijan and Kyrgyzstan, so it's all relative in some ways. When I first saw the title of this panel, I thought it was curious in many ways. The descriptions being, how does the U.S. fare under international standards, and then the title of electoral integrity. They kind of go counter to one another in some ways. It made me think about it, actually. But I think, let's be frank, on an international standards perspective, the U.S. is not faring well for all the reasons discussed today. The partisans administering elections is clearly something we don't see around the world. The boundary delimitation process, when I go around the world, that's the first thing well, there's two things that people highlight: gerrymandered election districts in the U.S. and money in politics, which they can't even imagine. The other thing that I think is not discussed very often is the malapportionment between House seats. I know not within a state, but across states, because of the cap of 435 seats in the House, there is malapportionment, which people can't even understand in many other countries. And then lastly, something we discussed earlier about the weakest link in the disparate electoral process and in the different ways that people interact with the electoral system, and the way that some people's votes probably likely to be more accurately counted in one state than another. Internationally, people would think that that's undermining fundamental notions of fairness and equal application of the law. So I think internationally, it's definitely the U.S. is struggling. But I do think that the thing that has saved us for the years in the United States is trust in the electoral process and election administrators, which I think ended up helping us in 2020. But that trust is eroding quickly, as we all know. It didn't just start in 2020. I would suggest it started in 2000 and the trust has been eroding ever since. But then we go back to this panel called Electoral Adequacy. And I do wonder how we want to think about that. Because internationally, when we talk about international standards, we use the terms we've heard today: transparency, nonpartisan election administration, free and fair elections, all of these terms. But in practice, are we really meeting those standards? And do we really need to have a different standard, that the results are adequate, that candidates, parties, and others accept election results? And maybe we have to get there first before we look to these really, really high standards that we're probably not going to meet. But that's something we have to think about internationally too, because we definitely measure other election commissions and election processes by those high standards. Well, that's all I'll say, because I'll be able to turn it to the panel now to talk about some of these issues. I'll introduce all of the panelists, and then I'll turn to Pippa Norris first. If you don't know Pippa Norris, she's the McGuire Lecturer of Comparative Politics at Harvard University. She's the founding director of the Election Integrity Project. Her latest book with Oxford University Press is In Praise of Skepticism, Trust but Verify. She also has a new book under development, The Cultural Roots of Democratic Backsliding. Erica Shine is the managing director of the Center of Applied Research and Learning at the International Foundation of Electoral Systems. She's co-author of multiple publications on electoral integrity, including Risk Limiting Audits, a guide for global use, Leadership in Crisis, ensuring independence, ethics, and resilience in electoral processes, and Election Audits, Principles, and Practices in another Oxford University Press publication called Election Watchdogs, Transparency, Accountability, and Integrity, which is yet another Pippa Norris book. And then James Gardner is the Bridget and Thomas Black State University of New York Distinguished Professor at SUNY University Buffalo School of Law, where he teaches constitutional law, government, and election law. His work, which looks at constitutional structure and design, focuses on two specific aspects of two specific areas: the law and legal structures for democratic institutions, and the structure and operation of different forms of government. And then finally, Larry Garber. Larry has more than 35 years of experience working in the field of national security policy, international development, human rights, and democracy promotion. He has managed governmental and non-governmental organizations. He has served in senior national security policy positions, taught high-ranking military and civil officials, and trained counterparts in more than 30 countries. Larry has led multiple electoral observations and advised senior leaders in several countries undertaking comprehensive electoral reforms following political transitions. So it's a group with a broad base of experience, and first I will turn to Pippa. Pippa? Okay, Pippa, you're up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And it's a pleasure to be with you all, even at a distance. I do apologise. The last meeting I went to that was live, I managed to get COVID, which did not help, as Chad will know. So what I'd like to do is contribute ideally towards the group by thinking about the challenges facing electoral integrity in America, giving a bigger picture than some of the issues which are focused on conventionally in the media, and thinking how we monitor state performance on a systematic basis. All of this is part of the Electoral Integrity Project, which has been going now since 2012. So first, what I'll do is just briefly mention the project for anybody who hasn't yet come across it, and particularly the concepts of electoral integrity that can be very controversial, and they can be defined in a very partisan way. And I'm going to focus also on what data sources are available. How do we have evidence? I'll then look at the global comparisons and think about changes over time and how the United States compares with many other countries around the world. And then we can drill down further to look at US elections by state and to think about public confidence in elections. What I'm going to argue above all in my overall view is as follows. Most federal countries have a central electoral management body, and this serves many functions. It may, for example, set certain standards in which it basically sets out what the actual core issues are on issues like voter registration or who is qualified to have suffrage. It provides technical training and administrative resources. It can recommend reforms to legislative bodies. It can adjudicate disputes, although courts can also do that. And it can help in terms of working with local authorities. But when we think about these issues, EMBs are either independent, like Elections Canada, or governmental, like in Germany, or they're mixed. The problem with the United States is it's exceptionally weak when it comes to the role of the US federal government, whether it's in terms of regulation, providing information, training, or all the other issues that election management bodies fulfill. And we can see that this contributes to a relatively poor performance of US elections if we look at this across several cross-national and time series data sets. And in particular, the expert survey data, which I'll show, indicates that US elections are relatively poor, although many countries have seen electoral backsliding. And expert elections can also be used to evaluate state-level elections and therefore to look at the changes over different states over time. And where states vary, whether it's Georgia and Massachusetts, whether it's California and Texas, I think this raises fundamental issues of human rights and essentially universal access to the basic functions of the ballot box. So there are some advantages to federalism. Innovations, for example, are clearly important. The way that different states have tried things on, say, redistricting, or they've tried different methods of mail balloting. Those are very positive, as always with federalism. But if it means that citizens in America have different facilities to vote, different opportunities to take part, different ways to register, then not only can this be seen as administratively inefficient, but it can also have fundamental problems for equal access, where one vote counts equally to every other vote. So let's look at some of the evidence. And I'm going to focus on the Electoral Integrity Project, founded in 2012, which asks the basic question, why do elections fail and what can we do about it? So this was well before 2016. And we rely in particular on three sources of evidence. Firstly, for the formal electoral rules, overall worldwide, we can use the Comparative Constitutions Project, an excellent look at the different ranges of electoral systems and administrative processes. But we can also look at how elections run, not just in terms of de facto, but de jure, through varieties of Democracy Project, which is an excellent project at the University of Gothenburg, and through our own perceptions of electoral integrity, state and cross-national surveys. And then, of course, we can drill down further to look at individuals and citizens, in particular through looking at the World Values Survey, where we've had a battery of items included, and that covers over 100 countries now. And of course, the Gallup World Poll also has some items on this as well. So what's the concept we run with? Well, when we started the Electoral Integrity Project, the term itself wasn't so widely used. And we didn't want to focus it on any one party, nor, for example, on issues simply about, say, electoral access and the extent at which there's voter suppression, or how far there's fraud, or how far there's voter ID. Instead, we wanted to root it as a global project in the United Nations and in the international commitments and global norms which have been endorsed in many different conventions, treaties, protocols, and guidelines. And these universal standards apply to all countries worldwide throughout the electoral cycle, including the pre-election period, the campaign, the polling day, and its aftermath. So we're not going to focus just on the count, for example, as many in America do, nor on who has access to get to the ballot or how they cast their ballots. It's a much broader set of ideas. And by contrast, malpractices refers to the violations of these international commitments. So the way that we think about this is as the conventional electoral cycle developed by the UNDP and others. And this says that any one chain, any one break in the chain has a problem for the performance of the election. So it may be the laws. For example, if they're too majoritarian and skewed against minority parties or particular regions, it may be the procedures which are followed in some detail, or the way in which boundaries are set, particularly issues of district redistricting or gerrymandering. There may be problems of voter registration. That's particularly common in many developing countries which are starting to run elections and which don't necessarily have effective information systems in place. Party registration could be another issue. Who gets onto the ballot along with the candidates? Campaign media, is there a level playing field? And what are the regulations of campaign media? Campaign funding, which turns out when we look at many, many countries to be one of the most problematic issues and the one which is least regulated worldwide. The voting process, the count, the results in a timely fashion being announced, and then the election management body itself. How is it composed? How independent is it? How structured? So again, in the US media, and particularly in the run up to the 2022 elections, we focus in particular on a couple of challenges. So for many, it's either a problem about the voting process, for example, how far there's voter identification for Republicans, how far there's ease of access to get to the ballot, who's on the voter registration. But in fact, the election needs to succeed at all the different levels and throughout all stages. And yet the amount of debate recently, for example, about campaign funding has been pretty minimal, along with other sorts of issues about election management in general. So what do we do to gather evidence? Well, the Perception of Electoral Integrity, PEI expert survey, is part of many other expert surveys which have been developed in the last decade. Think, for example, about Transparency International and the Corruption Perception Index. Everybody said you couldn't measure corruption. In fact, they did that. And that's been very influential in trying to increase transparency and stamp out corruption around the world. So we developed an annual survey covering all national parliamentary and presidential elections. We started it in mid-2012 in all the countries with a certain population, leaving out some microstates where it's difficult to get information. We currently have a database with about 10,000 experts who have been identified and verified. I'll talk about how in a minute. And the latest version of this, PEI 8, has assessments from 4,500 experts total, 480 elections worldwide, and 169 countries. Not every country, but most of the countries worldwide. And it goes annually 2012 to 2021. And we publish annual reports. An example is here by Holly Garnett, Toby James, and Madison McGregor. But we also do sub-national surveys, for example, of Russia, India, and the United States. And all the data is available for secondary analysis at Dataverse. These are the sort of questions we ask. We have almost 50 questions. We ask our experts some basic ways in which the election worked a month after each national contest. So, for example, on election laws, we asked them 3 items. Were election laws unfair to smaller parties? Did they favour the governing party? Did they restrict citizens' rights? And you can see we have a similar range of items on each of the different parts of the overall electoral cycle, say on procedures, boundaries, and so on and so forth. And the items are designed to be both positive and negative so that we get a balance. People can't just tick straight down the road, straight down the line. And we basically can create an overall scale by adding it all together. Our experts are political scientists or other social scientists, and we check that they have written about or have demonstrated knowledge of the electoral process. And this can be through membership of a research group, existing publications, university employments. We try to have a mix, about half and half for international and domestic, and the response rate overall is about 30%, which is quite common for expert surveys. Is the data reliable? Well, here what you can see is the data that we've generated. Electoral integrity is on the vertical axis, and going across the bottom is a separate measure, which is done by the Variety of Democracy projects at the University of Gothenburg, and they have a clean elections index. Now, you shouldn't expect it to be identical. We're measuring different things. We have different periods and a variety of other methodological issues, but you can also see there's a strong correlation between the PEI, Electoral Integrity Index, which is a 100-point index, low in places like Azerbaijan, Chad, Venezuela, Congo, high in Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Latvia, Cyprus, and so on, and the evaluations of the VDEM index. So it has some external validity in the sense that we're both coming to the same broad agreements. And it also has internal validity because we ask our experts a variety of characteristics. For example, in America, we ask about party identification, along with their age, their race, their gender, their values, and so on. And then we say, does that actually predict the evaluations of US electoral integrity? When we do a simple regression model, do these factors stand out? And as you can see from the last column, most of these are insignificant. So it doesn't really matter, surprisingly, whether people are left or right, or how familiar they are with an election and so on. The only indicator that comes out as significant is race, which isn't surprising given it's such a fundamental cleavage in American politics, but nevertheless, it again indicates that experts seem to have a consensus both internationally and then in our sample. Okay, let's look at the global comparisons. Let's look at the results. And firstly, let's look at it by world region. How does America compare? These are the 100-point electoral integrity index when you add up all of those 50 items together, and we've divided it up by basic global region. And immediately you can see that the United States scores, according to experts, in the overall elections 2012 to 2021, 57. How does this compare? Well, clearly in the Americas, Canada, Uruguay, Chile, countries, some of them which are long-standing democracies, some of which are third-wave democracies, Costa Rica, Panama, even Peru score higher than the United States. Now, of course, some places score much worse. Haiti, for example, which lacks any state capacity, Venezuela with Maduro, Paraguay, Guatemala with high levels of corruption and so on. Nevertheless, in the Americas, the United States comes out in the middle. And if we compare it with Europe, immediately you can see that again, we have some new democracies, some old democracies there, but essentially the United States elections, according to the experts, score worse than all of the European countries, including places like Bulgaria, Croatia, and Poland. And again, I won't go into all the detail. The detail is available if you want to look at other regions, Africa, Asia, and so on. But so far it appears the United States is not overall doing that well. Moreover, if we break it down by the type of regime, and we again compare the results, out of all liberal democracies, the United States is almost the worst. And even countries like Ghana, which again have only really been democratic since the 1990s, or countries like Benin, or other countries like Taiwan, overall, we can see that they rank better in terms of their levels of perception of electoral integrity. Now, what does it look like worldwide? This is the overall pattern, and this is from the most recent election, not just the cumulative. And it's the kind of traffic light colours. Green is positive, obviously Scandinavia, much of Europe. The United States, again, is middling. And we can see that many other places around the world are also falling into that categories. And we can see that, again, the United States is not an outstanding leader. And if we look at change, this is from the very first election that we monitored to the most recent election. What you can see is that backsliding, where there's essentially been a negative pattern on electoral integrity, is really very common. There's only a few countries which are green, which have improved the quality of their elections, according to the experts, over time. And in most cases, the elections have got worse, in some cases, a lot worse. If we break it down just for the United States, however, we've now monitored a series of elections, 2012 to 2020, using the expert survey. And this is based on the United States only. And what's striking is that the quality of the election, according to the experts, goes up very little. There is an improvement in 2018, according to the experts, but the pattern in 2020, overall, across all of the electoral cycle, is very similar to what it was in 2012. Despite all the challenges we're familiar with, despite all the controversies about American elections, according to how experts rate the election, it's actually been fairly flat, with the exception of an improvement in 2018. If we break it down further, however, the devil is in the detail, and immediately you can see when you look at the results section, which is, in other words, the declaration of results towards the end, how much are there protests, how much is there controversy, how much is there any issues of challenges, immediately you see that goes down a lot from 2012 to 2020. And of course, that's also being influenced by the run-up to the challenges of January the 6th. And the sharp decline from 2018 to 2020 is really quite remarkable. Just quickly, can we also do this by state in the United States? And we do. So this shows you the same methods, but instead of asking it about different countries, it's a special survey that we did in 2020 amongst 800 experts, just to look at how the United States varied from Alabama through to Wyoming across each of the different dimensions. And these again are color-coded. So what comes out as positive, according to the experts? Well, electoral procedures index, for example, the voting process, the vote count comes out as pretty good. It's green in most cases, not in everyone. And the role of electoral authorities. What comes out as problematic? Election laws, district boundaries and gerrymandering, and the middle issue of media and campaign funding. And you can rank all the states on this. So you can see the overall PEI index in the left column, and you can see that most of them do tolerably well, but nevertheless, there are variations which are quite substantial between those which have the highest ranking, Oregon, for example, Vermont, Washington, and those which are lower in the overall rating of the 100-point index. And we can look at changes by state. And this looks at the PEI election rating from poor to good on the on the vertical axis, and then the election rating when people are asked to give a summary for the quality of the election in their state. And we can see the changes here from 2016 to 2020. And in particular, certain states have really dropped behind. Georgia, Texas, Wisconsin, Alabama, Indiana, Florida, Arkansas. And you can immediately see which party won those particular states and how we can think about the problems which are there. By contrast, of course, we also have some states which experts regard as being very positive, moving up over time, although by and large, the 2020 ratings are worse than the 2016. They mostly fall below the overall line. What were the problems? Well, the problems in how experts saw the equality of the elections from 2016 to 2020, acceptance of the integrity of the elections by all parties, that's hardly a surprise, given the controversies and electoral denialism, public trust and confidence in the election, threats of violence during the election, the major red flag, which I'm concerned about and which keeps me up at night in terms of the 2022 elections, legal disputes, public protests, contention. By contrast, some items come out more positive. For example, the convenience of advanced voting facilities, contingency plans for emergency conditions, and the difficulties of casting a ballot. But by and large, more issues have got worse, as you can see, than have got better. So the last two things, public confidence, not surprising. This is an indication of how the public feels in a wide range of different societies about their own elections, and that's their confidence in the quality of their national elections, which is across the bottom. And then on the quality that actually works from VDEM is on the vertical axis. And what can you see? We have also, by the way, I should just add, open societies, which are in green, and closed societies, which are in red. The public overall is able to make a fairly accurate assessment of the quality and trust that they should place in their elections according to the Variety of Democracy Index. In other words, in Canada and Australia, for example, in Japan and Cyprus, and to some extent in the United States, the public gives a fairly positive support. They express trust in their elections. And in contrast, in places like Tunisia, Mexico, Guatemala, and of course the election we've just had in Peru and in Brazil, excuse me, the public places less confidence. In the countries which are closed societies, however, we see the contrary pattern. In other words, the more closed the society, the less information there is, the more people trust the elections. So the trust is highest in places like Myanmar, which is governed by a military junta, Indonesia, which has had fundamental problems of corruption, Iran, Tajikistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, China. So what that emphasizes is that confidence in elections in open societies is a fairly good indicator of how the quality of the election is, but not in closed societies where there's not much information. So to conclude, I'm sorry, Chad, if I'm going on for too long. This is the summary. Most federal elections have a good, effective EMB, and they do serve critical functions. If you look, for example, at Elections Canada, or you look at the way that elections are run in Australia, or you look at the way they're run in Germany, each of these are federal countries, but they all have a central EMB. And it really is important if you want to know how to improve technical training and give advice, if you want to share best practices, if you want to recommend structural reforms to the legislature, if you want to adjudicate problems after the election, if you want to monitor how states and local authorities do, then a federal government can play a fundamental role through the EMB at arm's length or through even a government department. But the US in the federal agencies is exceptionally weak, and I'd argue has got weaker over time, whether it's in control of funding, or whether it's in technical assistance, or whether it's in the standards which are there, for example, in terms of civil rights. We can use these indicators to monitor reliably scientific evidence through expert and mass surveys. We now have a number of alternative cross-national and time series data sets. And the experts basically say that long before 2016, and Donald Trump came down the golden staircase, and we had such tremendous controversy about American elections, there were signs earlier that American elections had certain weaknesses. The decentralization, the partisanship, and I'd argue that the lack of a federal role are all creating weaknesses. And what we can see most recently is that these weaknesses have been exacerbated through the challenges of contentious politics and the rise of authoritarianism and authoritarian populism. But the signs of electoral backsliding are not just in America, they're also evident worldwide, according to our evidence. And we need to evaluate this every election. And this is how we can get out of our trap of simply thinking of it in terms of the media definition of the problems, to really think more systematically about the performance of state elections with independent evidence of how the quality of the elections compares from one place to another. If you want more information, we have a number of reports and books, which I won't go into, but the data is available. And I really look forward to hearing everybody on the panel and seeing alternative contributions on this critical topic. Thank you very much.
All right. I think I do have some slides that'll come up, but I will get started. And you can all wave to me when it's up there. I'll just a quick note on my organization and the organization where Chad works, in case it's not a known commodity here. But our remit as an international NGO does not actually include the US, but we appreciate opportunities to look closer to home using the lens we use abroad. So, like Chad mentioned, when I heard the phrase electoral adequacy, I was a little bit puzzled. It's not a phrase that I've ever heard used before, at least in my line of work. But I can see that it's not without its practical advantages. So at IFAS, we tend to focus on electoral integrity, like Pippa was talking about as well, with an understanding that the concept is complex and imperfect. But what we are talking about when we use it is generally that an election has comprehensive, fair and practicable legal frameworks, transparent and professional election administration, sound operations and accurate results, accessible and fair electoral justice, dispute resolution mechanisms, inclusive and wide-ranging voter participation, and professional and impartial media reporting. And if you take a block out of that Jenga tower, it might not fall down, but we can't say that it really has full structural integrity anymore. So obviously using this kind of bar, this electoral integrity bar, rather than maybe adequacy, means that our assessments on election integrity can be rather grim, and I'm obviously in good company here on that note. And it's very likely they would be if we were to use them in the US as well. So I wanted to talk for a moment about our flagship assessment methodology that we use around the world. It focuses on vulnerabilities to election fraud, to systemic manipulation, and malpractice. Fraud has always gotten the most focus for good reason. I think among contemporary democracies, we can agree that it provides some common ground, transcends culture, geography, religion, but it's often used without nuance. So we distinguish fraud, a kind of deliberate wrongdoing, from simple malpractice and from systemic manipulation, which basically involves making bad behavior legal, taking purposeful advantage of regulatory gaps, and making structural changes to the election process that distort the playing field. So we look at 18 areas, 18 categories of the election process, and we look at the extent to which these areas comply with internationally recognized principles, obligations, good practices. We look at vulnerability, and we have a sort of scoring system that we use for vulnerability of a particular component to fraud or to systemic manipulation. We look at impact on election integrity. I won't go into it deeply, but this is the type of slide we include in our reports. It helps to highlight the sort of areas of the election process that are at greatest risk, that have big vulnerability and big potential impact on the electoral integrity or on the integrity of elections. So what these assessments do, and they tend to be sort of book length, is they expose gaps that increase the potential for deliberate wrongdoing, while also revealing problems that just stem from administrative or resource issues and require a very different kind of response. And this nuance allows us to give recommendations when we're working in different countries that target specific vulnerabilities, specific stakeholders, and their root causes. So again, we focus on vulnerabilities. It paints a really dire portrait. But the US is often excluded. I mean, this is the basis for this panel, right? That the US is often excluded from comparative reference or comparative analysis. But we think the EIA would be fit for purpose at the state level to provide that deep dive, and that it would reveal alarming inadequacies, to use the term. So one of the things in this kind of research effort we undertook was actually after the 2016 elections. We were thinking about how we often find that election practitioners, and I'm not really talking about this room, but people serving on election boards or secretaries of state seem to accept, at least they used to, as normal or even beneficial what international experts working in other countries would consider to be glaring deficiencies. So a kind of American exceptionalism. So to explore this hypothesis a little bit more rigorously, we conducted an online survey with a series of factual statements, as objective as we could get them, about the US election process, and asked respondents whether the scenario had a positive or negative impact on the credibility of elections in the US. This is a sample scenario. So we had two target audiences for the survey. We looked for international election experts with comparative experience but limited knowledge of the US. And then election practitioners in the US, as I mentioned, secretaries of state, election directors, others on election boards. And we complemented this survey data in a paper we wrote with a kind of light review taking on how we might do an election integrity assessment. It was fairly preliminary and fairly illustrative, but I think it gives you a sense of it. So we focused in that study on three categories: electoral system and delimitation, we have them sort of grouped together, voter registration, and institutional framework. So how did we choose these categories? One of our important sources was the PEI that Pippa was just discussing, election observation reports, and discussions with US election experts. So of course, these were not the bright spots. These were the most significant areas of concern. And I don't need to mention it because Pippa just went through it. You know, when the update has been done on the PEI, it still showed, you know, these areas as important areas of concern. So for this discussion, I'm just going to quickly focus on two of those categories to give a sense of how you could evaluate the US using these metrics. So the first was electoral system and constituency delimitation. So we start with a very basic sense of what are the international principles. You know, the electoral system needs to define the rules of the game for political competition, translate votes cast into seats, and while there's, in this case, no clear consensus on what type of electoral system is the best, there is an increasing and clear emphasis on representation and inclusion, which can mean different things in different places. But our key findings in the US, partisan districting of state legislative districts was the most serious vulnerability to systemic manipulation. And this was echoed in the Electoral Integrity Project, PEI, which focused on gerrymandering. To break up my discussion in the slides, I included, this is a graphic or a still shot from a whiteboard that we developed for our US election program that we run, and we did it virtually in 2020, where we bring together election managers from election management bodies from around the world. And how do you explain the US elections in a way that is understandable? And so you can see these on YouTube, but this was the one that was about gerrymandering and explaining gerrymandering in all of its pieces. So there you have that. But the significant malapportionment, as Chad mentioned, of single-member district sizes between states, clear violation of international standards, that's shocking to people. We regularly, in our assessments, we regularly cite malapportionment of single-member districts as a vulnerability in our assessments. And so when it came down to our actual survey findings, we did find that while the international survey respondents mostly viewed the disparity in district sizes between states as having a somewhat or very negative impact on the US election process, the practitioners from the US viewed it as having a fairly neutral impact on credibility. This is our electoral college whiteboard. Key integrity vulnerabilities related to elections for the executive were also systemic manipulation, the ability to lose the popular vote and be elected president is a structural feature of the American electoral system that contravenes the principles we hold fairly dear when we work in the rest of the world. So the other category was EMB institutional framework. And as Pippa mentioned, we generally look for a national EMB. There's all kinds of features and characteristics that we find to be beneficial. They take on a variety of institutional structures around the world. We do look to the Venice Commission, for example, that states or outlines that the body should be impartial and enjoy functional independence from the government. Key findings, not surprisingly, the absence of a federal EMB, the administration of elections for federal offices entirely by the states with minimal guidance at the federal level is highly unusual from an international perspective. Looking back at our survey results, while a vast majority of international experts found the practice to have a very or somewhat negative impact on electoral credibility, it was sort of reversed with the US practitioners. The majority found that it had a very or somewhat positive impact. So, the partisan administration of elections in the US, including that a chief election official can administer an election in which he is also a candidate, runs counter to international good practice, and again, more vulnerabilities to systemic manipulation. In addition to partisan influence, the decentralization of election administration in the US creates all kinds of vulnerabilities that we were parsing in the first panel that I don't need to mention again. But back to our survey, a majority of US election practitioners found that this practice had a neutral impact on credibility, but once again, the vast majority of international experts felt that it had a very negative or somewhat negative impact on the credibility. So when we did this study back in, it was around 2017, 2018, we proposed that the US needed to wake up to the idea that the electoral system and process writ broadly was deeply flawed and needed reform. I fear there could be a little bit of an overcorrection here. Trust has plummeted in the election process, but for the wrong reasons. Obviously, we saw that in the 2020 elections, instead of trying to address these very clear vulnerabilities to improve the process, political actors instead chose to, sort of make up narratives, baseless narratives, to further undermine it. So I think the question is, can this deepening distrust be redirected to help reform the system? I think, we haven't obviously done this type of analysis at the state level. I think there'd be lots of good material to work with, and it would be interesting. In particular, I really think it's crucial, as we've found it is in other countries, to understand the difference between malpractice, things like poor administration, fraud, stealing an election by stuffing a ballot box, and systemic manipulation. And I think the latter, that's the sort of ground, should be the source of our deepest concern, right? You can steal an election well before Election Day. So just a final note, another uplifting piece by Rachel Kleinfeld at the Carnegie Endowment highlighted how most democratic failure globally has been caused by elected governments using legal methods, gerrymandering, technical rule changes to derail democracy, supported by pluralities or majorities of their citizenry. She states, America is on precisely this path, and the community supporting US democracy needs a better strategy. So thank you very much for your time. I'm going to leave you with that.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
I'm going to stand over here because unlike the other speakers, I do not have the talent of reading my PowerPoint while my back is to it. And I'm going to stand over here because I think it allows me to see the screen and maybe talk to everyone, face everyone at the same time. So a couple of things. First, I'm going to bring the discussion much more emphatically back to federalism. And secondly, I need to apologize in advance because I'm going to have to go fast through some very basic stuff, but I don't think it'll be the stuff I go fast through is going to be controversial. So the title is a bit of a provocation. Is Arizona a liberal democracy? So I want to start by talking just about subnational variation in federal states pretty quickly. So federalism is clearly a system that contemplates some kinds of subnational variation. In fact, it's a system that is said to be designed to handle it, but typically we think of it as ethnic, linguistic, religious, cultural kinds of variation. And that's certainly what we see in federal states like Quebec and like Canada and Switzerland and Spain. But generally, we don't think of federalism as embracing the idea of political variation among subnational units, that is, variation in the basic form of political organization. Virtually all federations, all true federations, maybe I want to say, are liberal democracies, and that's really true all the way down. On the other hand, a fairly recent body of really interesting research has shown that in states that are transitioning from authoritarianism to liberal democracy, it is possible for certain subnational units to remain stuck in a sort of authoritarian kind of condition. This is Ed Gibson's work mainly. So you see that in provinces in Mexico, a couple in Argentina and Brazil. According to Gibson and Robert Mickey, who's also done good work in this area, the U.S. South before 1965 and maybe even longer could also accurately be described as an enclave of authoritarianism in a liberal democratizing state. Okay, that's point one, a quick point one. Quick point two, the global crisis of liberal democracy. I don't think any of this is going to be controversial. We know there's been a global turn to authoritarianism, even in some surprising places like 2 members of the European Union. And in addition, there's been democratic backsliding in what everybody thinks of as long-standing, stable democracies, either through the rise of a now powerful populist party or through actual participation in coalition government. This includes the United States at the national level, certainly during the period 2016 to 2020. I don't think any of that is controversial. One last point about democratic backsliding. How does it occur? Well, the old way is through a coup d'etat, tanks in the street, or through massive, quite naked, undisguised electoral fraud. The new way is a method of incrementalism. So here, an authoritarian-leaning party or leader acquires power quite legitimately using the democratic system, and then once in power, pulls up the ladder so that it can't be dislodged. That's to me, sort of the essence of what authoritarianism involves. All right, so are we seeing in the United States, a federal state, a growing heterogeneity of basic political organization at the subnational level? That's the question that I actually want to address. So first of all, what would count as evidence? Well, if we look abroad to see how this has worked in other countries, there are basically 2 places to look for evidence of democratic backsliding. One is in the formal constitution, and I'm going to call this the Hungarian model. Here you would see amendment or even outright replacement of a constitution in a way that alters arrangements, typically centralizes executive power, eliminates checks and balances, and suppresses effective partisan political competition. There's another model, though. So sometimes these developments actually occur, but they occur outside the formal constitution, even in direct violation of the constitution. So I'll call this the Polish model. And it's well known that constitutions in authoritarian states can be fake and not to be taken seriously. So the relevant developments may occur in extra-constitutional policy decisions or in informal ways of using power. So these are the 2 things you can be looking for. And this is a difference that tracks what legal scholars often call the difference between large C and small c constitutions. The large C document is the formal document. The small c Constitution is the network of informal norms on which it rests, and certainly during the Trump years, everyone in America got a lesson in the way that the formal Constitution depends upon a whole network of democratic norms. All right, so to look for evidence of democratic backsliding, I'm going to rely as my metric, my measuring stick here, on something that a lot of people have called the authoritarian's playbook. So democratic backsliding has become so common around the world that comparativists have actually been able to put together these sort of playbooks synthesizing the patterns. The one I'm going to use is the one I like best, which is Larry Diamond's, because it's quite comprehensive. So here's his 12-step authoritarian playbook. Demonize the opposition, undermine judicial independence, attack the media, gain control of public broadcasting and the internet, subdue civil society like civic associations and universities and NGOs, intimidate the business community into ending financial support for political opposition, enrich a new class of crony capitalists to create loyalists in the civil society, assert political control over the civil service, gerrymander districts, rig the rules, gain control over the body that runs elections, and then rinse and repeat. All right, so these are the criteria that I'm looking for. If we look at the large C constitutions of the American states, you're really not going to find anything that resembles this. No state constitutions have been recently replaced. The last state constitution that was replaced was Rhode Island's in 1986, and there hasn't even been a state constitutional convention called since then. There have been no recent amendments that concentrate executive power. Actually, they tend to go in the other direction, empowering the legislature. There are no recent judicial decisions interpreting existing provisions more favorably to the governor. That too tends to go slightly in the other direction, favoring the legislature. There are no charismatic populists leading a state. There is no Hugo Chavez, Juan Perón, or even a Huey Long or a George Wallace leading a state. Governors tend to be technocratic, bland personalities. On the other hand, when you're looking for this kind of stuff, it can be a little more complicated by the fact that governors under state constitutions already tend to be very powerful. Why? They deal with a part-time or amateur legislature. They tend to dominate the budgetary process. They have I think every governor now has a line item veto. And it's interesting, some of the most powerful governors in an index that Tad Bile put together year after year for decades are in politically liberal states like New York or California. So the large C constitutions do not provide much evidence of democratic backsliding at the subnational level. On the other hand, if you look at the small C constitutions of the states, you see a ton of activity. And here I'm going to go fairly quickly because I think some of this will be quite familiar to you. So using Diamond's authoritarian's playbook, so demonize the opposition. This means to me the denial of the political legitimacy of the opposition. We've certainly seen that in Wisconsin, Michigan, and North Carolina, where lame duck Republican legislatures enacted legislation stripping incoming governors of power just because they were Democrats. Undermining judicial independence, yeah, we see a fair amount of this. Court packing in Arizona and Georgia. Punishing judges for unpopular decisions, punishing them electorally, as in Iowa, for example, where 3 justices were voted out of office for their abortion ruling, threatening impeachment following the Pennsylvania Supreme Court's invalidation of the state gerrymander. Three of the Democratic justices on the court were threatened with impeachment. Okay. What about subduing civil society institutions? Well, an important liberal institution is universities, and there's been fairly significant attacks on universities in several states, so in the form of crippling budget cuts. This trend started beginning with the recession, but in these states it continued well after. I believe in Arizona, the budget of state universities was cut 55% between 2008 and 2018. And in Florida, just to make sure that the budget cuts stuck, the Florida legislature eliminated the state Board of Education, of Higher Education's ability to raise funds from non-state sources. Attacks on economically powerful supporters of the opposition. So in Russia, this means attacks on rich oligarchs by the Putin regime. In the United States, it tends to mean Republican states attacking labor unions, which are an economically powerful supporter of the Democrats. Right-to-work laws, this has been going on for a long time. New restrictions in Wisconsin and Mississippi on local governments bidding out contracts with a union membership requirement. Attacks on the independence of the, I'm just going down Diamond's list now, attacks on the independence of the civil service. Yeah, Arizona is on the cutting edge here, which essentially eliminated civil service protection for state employees, deprofessionalizing it and making civil servants dependent upon the favor of their employer. Weakening of public sector unions. Yeah, Wisconsin has been a leader here. Let's see. Okay, now, manipulation of electoral rules and processes. This is actually where most of the action has been. Proof of citizenship to register. Yeah, we see that. Registration purges in Kansas and Ohio. Onerous legal restrictions on registration drives in more states. Tightening of voter ID requirements. Repeal of voter convenience measures. And then I can't not mention Florida's, the legislature's subversion of the initiative to restore voting rights to felons. What about gaining control of the body that runs elections? In most states, that is the state legislature. So gerrymandering is the way you gain control of that. It's a highly successful program in 2010 run by the Republicans focusing on battleground states that did exactly that. I mean, here are some of the figures. In 2012, Republicans got 72% of the House seats on 49% of the votes, and it goes on and on. Let's not forget mid-decade redistricting, opportunistically when that's possible. So that's also gaining control of the body that runs elections. All right, so here's my summary. The leaders, according to this metric, the leaders in Democratic backsliding are Wisconsin and North Carolina. That won't surprise anyone. Not far behind Arizona, Florida, Kansas, and Texas. Okay, so what can we conclude from that? I would conclude the following. First of all, there's nothing happening in the United States that's anything like what's happening in the worst countries abroad, where the Democratic backsliding is the worst. So that's the good news. I didn't think I would be up here giving any good news, but because that's not what I do. But some states have traveled some distance down the road to populist authoritarianism. Arizona happens to be one of them, though it has not gone very far by global standards, and perhaps could still reverse course. Thank you.
So I want to add 2 points to Chad's introduction. It explains maybe why I'm here. First, I've been teaching for the last couple of years at Arizona State University's campus in Washington, a course on comparative election law, and it was good to have the opportunity to come visit the mothership, as it may be, here in Phoenix. And second, about 5 years ago, several colleagues and I who had been working on elections overseas decided to set up an organization which we called Election Reformers Network, which was designed to bring some of the lessons from our experiences overseas back to the United States and just introduce them into the popular discourse. One of the key ones that we've done has already been talked about, has been this issue of nonpartisan election administration, and I'll come back to that a bit in my closing remarks. Since I'm the last one on this panel, I'll refer a couple of times to some of the comments that my colleagues have made, and also to some of the comments that have been made in the earlier panels, and hopefully tee some issues up, if not for conversation here, then for those who are going to be part of the dinner this evening, we can talk further about them. So I'll divide my comments into 3 sections, and I should say I don't have a PowerPoint, and I'm glad I don't have a PowerPoint, because the quality of the PowerPoints that were up there were much better than anything I could have produced in terms of graphics and the like, and so probably the better choice not to have one. So I want to talk a little bit about the terminology we use in the context of assessing elections. Distinguish between the role that I've often played as an international observer who is assessing an election and that played by those who are constitutionally mandated to be responsible for resolving election disputes, and then talk about a couple of specific cases and then come back to the United States. So let me start with the terminology, and again, I too was struck by the use of the term electoral adequacy. We started out in the international conventions of the Universal Declaration and then the various covenants using terms like periodic and genuine elections and then referencing the importance of a secret ballot. For a period, we went through just referring to the colloquial phrase free and fair elections. A colleague of mine wrote a book in 2004 saying we need to think about beyond free and fair elections. And I'll get into a little bit of what that has turned into. But from an international observer perspective, we've often used terms like an outcome that reflects the will of the people. Of course, how do you decide that if you're sitting there as an international observer trying to make those decisions? A process that is consistent with international standards. What are those international standards? And then, assuming you can get agreement on them, what is considered a passing grade or electoral adequacy in the context of this panel. We've also talked about imperfections in the electoral process that actually resulted in the thwarting of the will of the people. But again, the questions of what evidence you're looking at becomes a big question in these international observer contexts. And then I'll just note one of my favorites. I was part of this delegation. In fact, I was the person on the ground in Zimbabwe in 2018 for the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute. And quote, this is our conclusion, "We note several improvements to the electoral process compared to Zimbabwe's past elections. Though equally important, shortcomings give rise to deep concerns that the process did not make the mark. Incremental improvements in the electoral environment during the pre-election period were insufficient to establish broad confidence among the political competitors and Zimbabwe's sharply divided populace." And the reality of this, it had no effect in Zimbabwe itself, but in terms of the international community, it was quite influential, particularly for countries that have imposed some forms of sanctions on Zimbabwe and had set election quality and improvements in the election process as the basis for revisiting those sanctions. So my contention is that the search for a shorthand terminology reflects a more conceptual debate among both international observers and academics. And the divergence relates to, what is the purpose of considering these assessments? So in some instances, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a second, it's to resolve a concrete election dispute and to determine the election winner or to determine whether the election should be deemed invalid. In other instances, the goal is to identify weaknesses in the election system and to promote improvements. And then third, and this goes to the excellent work that Pippa Norris was talking about, the assessment actually contributes to the ability to provide a comparative ranking of countries or states and their compliance with international standards and assumed best practices. So how does this play out in practice? And we've heard several examples. Pippa mentioned 11 criteria that she uses. I think Erica mentioned 18 criteria that IFAS uses. NDI, where I used to work, has a publication that has 16 factors. The Carter Center has 10 factors. They all draw from the same international documents. You can parse the distinctions between them. But the bigger question is, so what do you do? I mean, they're helpful if you're going in there to provide technical assistance and help guide the reform process. But what do they help in terms of assessing an election process in terms of, was it free and fair? Did it comply with international standards? How many bad marks do you need to fall below the mark, and how many good marks do you need to qualify? And it's worth noting that this is a big difference between how what I call the constitutionally mandated institution for resolving disputes view these issues, which is a much more simplistic and I would say minimalist formulation, which generally runs around two big questions. Did the voters, the citizenry, those who are eligible to vote, have an opportunity to cast their vote freely? Usually the secret ballot is viewed as the condition there. And is there evidence of manipulation of the vote count? And if those two things cannot be proven, then there's very little basis for this constitutionally mandated institution for invalidating an election. There's one wrinkle that I want to mention which relates a little bit to the discussions that we've been having, which is often the question is, with respect to these constitutionally mandated institutions, are they really independent? And when you get into some of the issues that Jim was raising about authoritarianism. It's not only the election commission, but it's the courts too. And are the people who are responsible for resolving election disputes going to have the trust, the confidence of the population to be viewed as definitive with respect to these issues? So that becomes, a question. And oftentimes, as an international observer, we look at, is this a independent entity that's making these decisions? And so I'll just give 3 quick examples and then make a closing remark. So I mentioned that I was in Zimbabwe in 2018, and there we had a case where the elections were disputed, and the court, which was not viewed as independent by those who were bringing the case, but they felt obliged to use the constitutionally mandated processes, the court basically said that you hadn't proven your case. You hadn't produced sufficient evidence to show that the vote count had been manipulated. And because you hadn't met your burden, therefore the election complaint was dismissed. A contrast is Kenya, and here we have 2 interesting examples, one in 2017 and one in a couple of months ago in 2022. The first case, the Kenya court, to the surprise of many, including international observers, who had initially given the Kenya election, in a sense, a good bill of health, concluded that there were technical violations of the Constitution, and once you find those technical violations, you automatically have to invalidate the election and require a rerun. By contrast, in 2022, where there was an obvious issue that could have led to the court to come to a similar conclusion, which was that the election results announced by the chairman of the Independent Election Commission was not supported by a majority of his fellow members of the Election Commission, the court nonetheless decided that this election met muster and dismissed the complaints. And again, to the surprise of many, the process resulted in a peaceful transfer of power and is now a good example of how a court can gain the trust of the population in that situation. So let me just close with reference to the United States and some of the issues that we've been discussing here. So first, in terms of the calls that organizations like the Election Reformers Network have been making for nonpartisan election administration, I think we need to distinguish, and I don't know if Rick will disagree or agree, between the having a federal body that's responsible for that, which might be the gold standard, and at least at the current time, focusing on election management bodies that are nonpartisan at the state level, which is responsible for administering our elections today, and will continue to be for the foreseeable future. So my focus is on, what can be done at the state level. There too, I'm not optimistic about having these nonpartisan election administration bodies installed in the next 5 years, 10 years. But I do think we should focus, and a couple of the speakers have already referenced this, to smaller things that we can do, such as requiring adherence to conflict, or even establishing conflict of interest rules that would govern the role of the chief election officer and others who are in positions of leadership for election administration, and maybe more boldly setting some qualifications for election administrators, having some process like we do with judges of, do they meet the muster? Do they have the basic levels of expertise that one would want in a election administrator who's responsible ultimately for the decisions about how an election is going to be administered, and in some cases for, at least initially, resolving the questions on who won or lost the election. The final point that I want to make is we keep talking, and I struggle with this, is, so how do we find these people? Who are these people who are going to be independent election administrators and are going to have the trust of the population? What are the qualifications for it? That they never, ever participated in an election, that they never, ever were affiliated with a political party? What is it that we're looking for? And again, here I think our model is, what we expect of judges, but we need to remind ourselves that the United States is not only the only country that does not have a independent election administration, but we're also a country that in many states we actually elect judges, sometimes on a nonpartisan basis, but in some places on a partisan basis. And I think we need to, understand the implications of that, particularly as we're focusing, many of us, on the federal judiciary and simply, looking at who is the president who appointed X judge or X justice, and that somehow suggesting that we know the outcome of their decisions in a particular case. So I think we can learn a lot from the judicial selection process as it relates to trying to create this idea of a independent election administration, but we also need to appreciate how this has worked in the United States over the past centuries. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. We don't have a lot of time left, so yes. Okay, just go right to a question. Yes. Well, I was. Because I don't want to interrupt you. No, we definitely don't have a lot of time, so let's just start with questions. That's fine.
First, a comment to Larry's last point about electing judges. Everyone poo-poos electing judges, but in fact, they were that system of judicial selection was intended to provide judges with greater independence from legislatures, and that may be something that we're actually looking for here. So I don't think that's, I think there's lots of nuance there. Secondly, I wanted to ask the members of the panel, this is for Rick's sake, for his next paper, where he's going to be arguing in favor of a centralized management body, and it seems to me then he would, or electoral management body, it seems to me that he would need research demonstrating that a very rigorous regression analysis showing that the greater the centralization of the electoral management body, the greater the electoral integrity, controlling for other factors. And so the question for Pippa and for everyone else on the panel is that research there? Has it been replicated? And then finally for Pippa, one quick question. She's getting the book. Good, that's great. Great. For her cycle of the electoral process, I didn't see electoral adjudication in there, and I'm wondering why, because that's a very, very critical issue in so many democracies. So I'll stop there.
Sure. If I'd like to contribute on the last thing, the issue of electoral disputes is vital, and the idea that we should have somebody to informally bring together the different parties before we go to a formal court is often absolutely critical, particularly in a country of post-conflict where we're emerging in a peace process, and you want people to talk to each other. It's rather like divorce. You want informal mediations before you have formal. So it's part of that final stage of trying to make sure there's not contestation about the results, or to manage that anyway. In terms of centralization, it's complicated, it really is. Electoral management bodies, the best work, if you're interested in this, is International IDEA, who have done a really good classification worldwide of many different dimensions. But even when we talk about things like an independent EMB, what does that mean? Does it mean they have their own budget? Does it mean that they have to make an annual report to Parliament? Does it mean that there's a process of appointment, which is through a public adjudication or other methods? What are their powers in office? How long do they serve, et cetera, et cetera? So it really is not a simple matter of either you're a governmental official or you're an independent EMB. The devil is in the detail. And I think we need that conversation in America to really say, how do we actually process this? And maybe, ideally, what I would do is not start with aggression. I'd start by visiting Canada. I'd start by bringing our Australian colleagues from the AEC. I'd start by bringing in the UK Electoral Commission. And I think IFES, for example, would be a perfect host for that sort of dialogue to really learn from each other. When I visit those EMBs, they actually do talk to each other very frequently, but it's often behind closed doors. And I think a public discussion, maybe after the 2022 election, would be invaluable to inform everybody about alternative models, they're not all the same, and how they see the role of EMBs and EMB independence.
And to follow up with that, as Erica mentioned, we bring in election management bodies from around the world to observe US elections. We usually do it even every 2 years, but we didn't do it this year, but we'll do it in 2024. And first of all, everybody's completely shocked at what they see, and not a good way. But I do think that could be an opportunity to have more of that dialogue, to have some of those election management bodies from Canada, from the UK and other places to be able to talk about these issues.
I think just one note I would want to add on the question of centralization, and I don't think it necessarily has this sort of intrinsic value. You have to be centralized for it to be effective. The way I think about it is that there are kind of effects or impacts of having centralization that are different from what we see in the U.S. If you think about one person, one vote, I think arguably you can look at the U.S. system and see the disparities between a voter using a particular system, a particular process in Florida, and a different system and different process in New Jersey. And if you had centralization, or at least some kind of overarching body that provided more guidance or more requirements, more resources, things like that, you might have a different outcome. And then the other piece of it is, I think we focus, at least in our line of work, a little bit less on the centralization, just because it's a matter of course, they're all centralized. And more on independence and autonomy. And we spend lots of time parsing what that means, and lots of people have done that. And there's data out there, and I'd say it's not clear-cut, clearly on the impact of autonomy in different ways of measuring it on the election outcome. So I think that's the other interesting piece of it.
Great. Just a quick comment first on just citing a recent work that Election Reformers Network did, was specifically to the point of comparing or trying to educate, inform people about Elections Canada and how they operate as and how it might inform some of our discussions in the United States. And I think that's the big part. At this point, we just need to create more of a discussion about this process. For better or worse, 2022 has led to these issues being not only in the back pages of Rick's books, but now on the front pages of the newspapers about who's running for secretaries of state and the like. And I think that's healthy, and we just need, and this conference is a good opportunity to use those examples more so. And again, just on the point about centralization, I mean, I made it in response to some of the discussion here, but I really do think that, when we talk about centralization in the United States now, we're talking about, as Rick said, about the state level. I mean, that is really where we need to be centralizing. And I think Pippa's listing of the 50 states and ranking of them, helps us also to realize that you can and should be looking at the states as autonomous entities when it comes to election administration, and we're not going to be, doing a federal election process anytime soon.
Just very quickly to follow up with that, I think Canada is very interesting because each province has its own election commission. I just was texting the head of election Saskatchewan, First Nations issues, and they have very different but centralized election commissions in those provinces. And the Elections Canada only manages federal elections, and they're very simple paper ballot that they use. But I think it's absolutely something we have to look at, is how Canada has done this and the levels of trust. I think one way to look at the question is the level of trust. And I would say that the level of trust in elections in Australia and Canada are much higher than here. Could be a way to look at it, but I'm not a political scientist. So, question, yes?
It's more of a comment, more like marrying this panel to the prior panel, which is on this last point about states. States have their constitutions are much easier to amend. If we're looking to create an independent executive, or one person or even a body which is more independent of the political process than it can possibly be under the U.S. Constitution now. And because the states have direct democracy, as we've seen with the various a number of redistricting initiatives that you see at the state level. It actually seems to me that an agenda would be to find some states of the 24 states that have direct democracy to actually put together some kind of independent state-level management body which is not either bipartisan or an elected partisan individual, and actually develop a model that does that and see if it gets adopted somewhere. I mean, we have 24 states with direct, even, it's possible to come out of a state legislature, I doubt it, but there are 24 states with direct democracy. And just as you get in places like California, you got a redistricting initiative that came out of the voters. It just seems to me if we want to test this out, the best way to do it would be for somebody to develop this at a state level with one of the states with direct democracy.
Yes, okay.
Curious, international lessons to be learned. Restoring what's called loser's consent by some folks. You know, the complaint, "we was robbed," is natural. You see your candidate beat, you get upset, but then you let it go and you move on and the candidate moves on with life. We're not seeing that here now. There are prominent candidates who are claiming that they were robbed, and they are making a career out of claiming they were robbed. Are there international lessons to kind of curb that? We've got the First Amendment, so these people are free to say whatever they want, but it strikes me as a very corrosive thing, as if somebody can literally make a living for years complaining they were robbed, complaining the system is illegitimate, fundraising off of it, and riling up significant portions of the population.
I'll get everybody else to answer this as well, but I think, you know, Mexico is really interesting. There was zero trust in the electoral process in Mexico, and they did set up institutions that did restore trust. They're being attacked now, but they really did restore trust in the process. But it took extraordinary reform and extraordinary change to do that. One, as I'll go down all the panel can address that in a way. I've always been surprised in my experience how little U.S. experts are very interested in international perspectives. The paper that Erica was talking about, I wanted to call it America's blind spot, because we have all these election administrators who thought some of these things that internationally we see as terrible, they thought were good. And so the question that I have for the panel, and Larry, I'll start with you on election observation. Susan Hyde from Berkeley just did a study about election observation in the United States actually increasing trust. They did surveys, and they have some ideas of how local observation can increase trust in the process. So my question for everybody is, what do you, on this issue of Americans not being that interested in U.S. comparative examples, do you have some experience that you think would be something that would help the discussion to be able to, like we talked about Canada, are there other ways that we could start to get Americans to look at experiences that have increased trust and improved process?
So I think it's a long slog.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're trying to do that a bit with some of the work that we're doing, and just in response to the comment, again, we're a little bit more pessimistic about even the election management body being resonant, but on some of the issues of codes of conduct, conflict of interest, qualifications, we are looking at about half a dozen states where we've gotten some, positive feedback from the, some parts of the legislature, or whatever. Also, I mean, how many folks know that U.S. elections are internationally observed? That every 4 years there are, and even every 2 years. I got a call earlier this week, you guys probably got the same, from the OSCE, that they want to meet to discuss the U.S. midterm elections, because they have a delegation here. They produce, very, comprehensive reports, other than a few academics and folks like Chad, Eric, and myself. I don't think anyone really pays much attention to them. So we got a long way to go in that sense. The final thing I'll just say is, and I think I mentioned it to a couple of people earlier, is some of the issues that we do observe overseas that we come back here and say, why isn't that, sort of standard practice here? And again, it's not only not standard practice, but it's not even politically correct to talk about it. So ID laws, I mean, absolutely exist in every country that we work in, and yet here it's become such a polarized issue. Ballot harvesting, again, it's something that we would, basically criticize when we're overseas, and yet here too it's become somewhat of a political football in terms of where you come out and what constitutes ballot harvesting and how you should do it. So there are even some of those examples that we need to appreciate, need to be seen through a U.S. filter, and the debate here is going to be different perhaps than it is in other countries.
Well, James, I have a question for you. You said something in your presentation that you weren't seeing this in the federal level. You didn't see as much of the backsliding. That wasn't as bad as you see. I forget the term you used. It's nothing like we're seeing internationally. I don't know. There was I forget the exact term. But do you worry about there being a tipping point? When we talked earlier about there not being any cost to this behavior, as people learn there's not a cost, as a matter of fact, there's a reward to some of this behavior, are you worried that that could change?
I have my own mic. Yes. Yes. That's my nightmare. Okay, well, I was too optimistic in my talk. I think we've reached that tipping point. I don't think there's any going back to the kind of liberal democracy we had between the end of World War II and, 2016. It's true. It was rotting at the foundations, and we didn't, or not enough people realized that. And the foundation of successful liberal democracy is something that Pippa can't measure, which is a belief in it and desire for it. Comparatives are fairly united that the most important factor leading to belief in and support for liberal democracy is performative success. And liberal democracies performed highly successfully in prosecuting the Second World War, in the civil rights movement, but they've done a bad job at dealing with the issues of today: climate change, gross inequality. So unless I'll speak about the United States, unless the United States as a liberal democracy can demonstrate performative success, we will see erosion in belief that that's even a good form of government. And the interesting thing about the Republicans under Mitch McConnell is that they seem to understand this, because their only goal seems to be to deny the federal government any kind of performative success. The thing that worries me is that people will look at that at the federal level and say, this is a type of government that does not perform well, and they will see the only performative success coming out of any aspect of the system is coming out of states that are dominated by one party and are trending illiberal. And that will change public attitudes.
Right, we're almost out of time, so just
There's a
very
question
quickly.
over there.
Well, Pippa, I think, put a slide on. I think she's looking at this issue specifically. Pippa, did you have a response? Oh, I guess not. Well, why don't we go to the question?
Can I ask just a historical question about when the U.S. was a liberal democracy? In the comparative context, I think the data started rather recently in some ways that have been collected as international comparisons. But is there any sense of the moment at which the U.S. was actually, we talked about backsliding, but backsliding from what and over what period? Because if you're starting after the Second World War, we have some enclaves of authoritarianism that are pretty widespread in a lot of different ways. Like, it's beyond the South, as someone speaking from Arizona. So is there a moment where you can say the U.S. had a solid liberal democracy from an international perspective? Or was, yes, I'm gonna stop there.
think I'll leave that to, I don't know if Pippa has a response to that.
Chad, yes, Chad, I've got a couple of things. One is a slide. I'm doing a new book actually, which is called The Cultural Roots of Democratic Backsliding. This shows you a summary of a net changes in democracy and development during the 21st century, i.e. from 2000 onwards, what's changed. And so you've got countries which have gone backwards according to VDEM and countries which have gone forwards. But this is the United States, the green blob here. And essentially, as you can see, it really is a moderate change. There are lots of countries which are much worse than us. Hungary, Poland, Nicaragua, Turkey, Thailand, India, Benin, Brazil, you know that. You know how far they've gone backwards. Contrary, there are countries which have gone forwards in that period as well. Liberia, Lesotho, Malawi, etc. So varied patterns. The US is backsliding fast, but not as bad as some other countries. That's point one. Can I give you point two? Which is I wanted to refer back to the comment about losers' consent. And this for me is the heart of why Republicans are using malpractices and manipulation of elections, because they have not won the popular vote right the way back in every presidential election since 1988. I mean, that is pretty stunning. If you look at the pattern, this is the percentage, not of the Electoral College, the popular vote. And as you can see, they just are falling behind that 50% mark, which is what you need in America under a two-party system. By contrast, the Democrats haven't done great, but they at least have done better. The only exception is, of course, after 9/11. So we have to have incentives in which both parties feel they have a stake in the system. If one party feels they consistently lose the White House, but they still have enough power to gain gubernatorial seats and to gain states and thereby change the election, they're going to do that. And to change this system means moving from winner-take-all towards, for me, mixed-member proportional electoral systems, which is a heavy lift. But unless you change that electoral system, in a two-party race, one party is going to say, we always lose, let's not play by the rules of the game. Those incentives are baked in to our current electoral system, and they just have to be changed one way or another. That's my plea.
On your question of liberal democracy, I guess it's how do you define it? I know when I go around the world, people talk about so many issues, Native Americans, you go down a long list. When I definitely, when I'm out and I'm trying to work on this issue, people are very quick and eager to point out the problems with US elections and democracy. But the point, I don't think that makes that it's less valuable. I just think that we're part of the community to talk about it. So I actually use it as, yes, we have lots of problems, but we need to talk about it and work on it. And it actually helps sometimes when you acknowledge that you've got problems and you need to fix it when you're working internationally. We're out of time, so I want to thank the panel and thank everybody today, and look forward to having the dinner tonight, and thanks.
Thank you, Chad. Thanks, everyone.